In the rugged heart of Mexico's Sierra Madre Mountains, where roads are carved more by rain than by machines, a boy named Joaquin Guzman Loera was born into the dust and silence of La Tuna. The village, tucked between steep ridges and acres of poppy fields, seemed to exist beyond the reach of clocks. There were no factories, no lights flickering in the night, just silence, hunger, and the smell of the earth after rain. Joaquin's family, like many in the region, lived off subsistence farming. His father, Emilio Guzman, was a cattle rancher, and by whispered accounts, a low-level opium grower. Their house was made of dirt floors and corrugated tin. Meals were simple beans, tortillas, sometimes eggs if luck allowed. But hunger was a constant. So was ambition. Even as a child, Joaquin noticed how the wealthiest men in the region didn't work the fields. They moved quietly with thick wads of cash, dressed in boots that never seemed to touch the mud. They came in pickup trucks and left with satchels. They spoke softly, but were listened to. They were part of something bigger, something invisible and dangerous. Joaquin watched and remembered. By the time he was a teenager, he'd been kicked out of school and turned fully to the land, not to farm it, but to use it. He began tending marijuana and poppy fields for local traffickers. Unlike others, he didn't just follow orders. He asked questions, learned routes, observed behaviors. Where others saw backbreaking labor, he saw logistics, supply chains, volume, demand. His mind turned every harvest into opportunity. In those mountains, criminality wasn't rebellion. It was survival. There were no scholarships, no safety nets. A life outside the narco economy was a life of slow starvation. Joaquin chose differently. He began working under a local drug trafficker named Pedro Aviles Perez, who saw in the boy a dangerous blend of loyalty and cunning. Guzman ran errands at first, moving bundles across remote paths, sometimes barefoot, to silence his steps. But he moved fast, always returned, always followed up. Trust began to form. In this early phase, Joaquin picked up his lifelong tactics: reward those who obey, eliminate those who talk, and never leave a debt unpaid. He was meticulous, calculating, and unlike most, willing to take losses in the short term for gains that others couldn't see yet. But it was the moniker that stuck El Chapo, meaning Shorty. He stood just over 5 feet tall, but what he lacked in height, he made up for in presence. In a world where physical dominance often ruled, Guzman demanded attention with stillness. He didn't shout. He calculated. His power wasn't loud, it was precise. By the early 1980s, El Chapo had caught the attention of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the head of the Guadalajara Cartel, the largest drug trafficking syndicate in Mexico at the time. Gallardo was a businessman cloaked in a drug lord's shadow. He needed someone who understood both the mountains and the men who moved through them. Someone hungry, invisible, reliable. Guzman was given more than just tasks, he was given routes. And in the world of narcotics, routes were everything. He began managing shipments of cocaine and marijuana across the U.S.-Mexico border, coordinating drop-offs, bribing police, setting up airstrips, and organizing convoys. He noticed what others didn't: weather patterns that delayed helicopters, border patrol rotations, corrupt officials who were overpaid but underloyal. He adjusted, improved, refined. He didn't just move drugs, he optimized the system. Guzman also earned a reputation for brutality. One story from this period tells of 2 smugglers who stole from one of his shipments. El Chapo allegedly had them buried alive. Whether the tale is true or myth, it traveled far and fast, sowing his name into the fears of rivals and the respect of allies. But there was something else brewing beneath the logistics and discipline of vision. Guzman didn't want to be a route manager. He wanted an empire. Not the kind built on power for power's sake, but the kind that could control trade, dictate prices, and outlive any government. This vision began to take shape quietly. He started recruiting his own men. Not many, just a few. Loyal, quiet, and willing to die for him. He treated them well paid on time, protected their families, avenged their deaths. He offered something the state could not structure, and structure breeds loyalty. By the end of the decade, El Chapo had become more than a name. He was a node in a network, a force moving westward, and the boy from La Tuna, the boy with dirt on his knees and hunger in his belly, had transformed into a ghost, moving through cities in armored vehicles, down desert roads, and through corridors of power on both sides of the border. The trail had begun. The birth of the kingpin. It was the year 1989 when the fragile structure of the Guadalajara cartel began to collapse. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the godfather of drug trafficking in Mexico, had been arrested, leaving a power vacuum that splintered his empire into fragments. In the chaos that followed, those who had once obeyed began carving territories for themselves. Brothers turned into rivals, and loyalty became a commodity. From this fractured cartel, three powerful forces emerged: the Tijuana cartel, the Juarez cartel, and the Sinaloa cartel. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman took the Sinaloa name not out of sentiment, but strategy. The region was isolated, hardened, and deeply rooted in a culture that distrusted authority. The people here didn't just tolerate traffickers, they relied on them. Guzman didn't inherit Sinaloa. He merged with it. Unlike other traffickers who flaunted their wealth, El Chapo remained pragmatic. He preferred compound walls over red carpets and loyalty over luxury. But make no mistake, he was building a kingdom. His cartel became a living organism. Each part had its function: logistics, security, finance, intelligence, counterintelligence. The sophistication was military. Guzman didn't just hire thugs, he trained soldiers. Many came from the Mexican military itself, disillusioned and looking for better pay. Others were plucked from the streets, reshaped with discipline and brutality. At the heart of El Chapo's strategy was transportation. He realized that controlling routes was more powerful than owning territory. While other cartels fought over plazas, he looked beyond borders. Cocaine from Colombia, marijuana from Sinaloa, heroin from the Golden Triangle, methamphetamine synthesized in jungle labs, all of it needed a way in. El Chapo provided it. He revolutionized the industry by investing in logistics like no trafficker before him. Trucks, planes, submarines, and most famously, tunnels. He pioneered an underground highway system beneath the U.S.-Mexico border, equipped with rails, lighting, and ventilation. While border agents scanned trucks above ground, his cargo moved silently beneath them. But his most potent tool wasn't steel or cement, it was corruption. Guzman understood that bullets could silence one man, but money could blind 1,000. Bribes flowed like rivers through city halls, police stations, and military barracks. Judges dismissed charges. Politicians turned their backs. Mayors hosted him in secret. Even American border agents, some say, were not immune. In his world, there was no wall money couldn't scale. He became fluent in the currency of influence. This blend of infrastructure and bribery made the Sinaloa cartel a transnational power. By the mid-1990s, El Chapo was moving hundreds of tons of narcotics into the United States every year. Chicago, Los Angeles, Phoenix, New York. The drugs flowed through them all. His network reached as far as Europe, Asia, and West Africa. But with expansion came danger. Rival cartels saw Sinaloa's growth as a threat, particularly the Arellano Felix brothers of the Tijuana cartel. They ruled the border city like a private kingdom, brutal, flashy, and heavily armed. A deadly feud erupted between the two cartels, culminating in one of the most infamous public shootouts in Mexican history. In 1993, at the Guadalajara airport, gunmen from both sides exchanged fire in broad daylight. Amid the chaos, a cardinal, Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, was shot and killed. The official explanation claimed mistaken identity. Others whispered that he was assassinated for knowing too much. The backlash was swift and international. Suddenly, El Chapo was no longer just a name whispered in corridors. He was headline news. The Mexican government, under pressure from the Catholic Church and the United States, was forced to act. Guzman was captured shortly after in Guatemala and extradited to Mexico. The man who had built an empire in shadows now found himself behind bars at Puente Grande, a maximum security prison. But what seemed like a defeat was in fact a redirection. Even from prison, El Chapo retained command. He continued to run the cartel from inside his cell, communicating through bribed guards and coded messages. Operations didn't slow. In fact, some say they became more efficient. With fewer distractions and tighter control, he managed the empire with surgical precision. Inside Puente Grande, he wasn't a prisoner. He was the warden in all but name. He held parties, ordered gourmet meals, moved freely within the facility. Inmates deferred to him. Guards served him. His legend grew. But El Chapo wasn't content with power. He wanted freedom. And in 2001, after nearly 8 years in prison, he orchestrated an escape that would make him mythic. He disappeared inside a laundry cart. Rolled out of the gates by a bribed employee, he vanished into the Mexican countryside, igniting a manhunt that would span years. Some called it a disgrace to national security. Others saw it as the ultimate symbol of his cunning. From that moment on, El Chapo was no longer just a trafficker. He was a ghost, a figure whose name inspired both fear and awe. And as the world searched for him, he rebuilt, faster, smarter, deadlier. Empire in the shadows. While most fugitives live in fear of being found, El Chapo operated as if he had never left. His escape from Puente Grande wasn't the end of his reign, it was the beginning of its most dangerous chapter. From 2001 onward, Joaquin Guzman vanished from the surface but expanded underground literally and metaphorically. His return to power was not dramatic. It was methodical. Piece by piece, he reassembled his empire. Territories that had once been contested fell back under Sinaloa's control. Former rivals either pledged allegiance or disappeared. Those who thought his escape was a temporary trick soon learned otherwise. He didn't just escape a prison, he escaped limits. At the core of his rebirth was one simple idea: stay invisible, make everything else move. El Chapo adopted a policy of decentralization. He rarely stayed in one place more than a few nights. Hidden in the Sierra Madre, surrounded by hills, lookouts, and loyal villagers, he created a security network stronger than steel. Locals were paid handsomely to report any outsider, and they obeyed not just for money, but for survival. His influence wasn't merely financial, it was cultural. He built schools, paved roads, and sponsored religious festivals. To many, he wasn't a criminal. He was protection. He was order. Meanwhile, the Sinaloa cartel grew into a hydra. Cells operated in cities across Mexico, the U.S., and South America. Each was self-contained, each linked only by a thread: Guzman's command. He became more than a boss. He was a myth, a story whispered between shipments. His absence became his presence. By 2009, U.S. authorities had labeled El Chapo the most powerful drug trafficker in the world. Forbes listed him among its annual billionaires. He was dubbed the godfather of the drug world. And yet no photos existed of him, no confirmed sightings, no fingerprints. just a trail of cash, drugs, and fear. His operations evolved with the times. Cocaine still moved in massive quantities, but methamphetamines became the new frontier. Cheaper, faster to produce, and wildly addictive meth gave the cartel even tighter profit margins and expanded markets. El Chapo invested in labs buried in the jungle, shielded from drones guarded by former military. And while others trafficked drugs, El Chapo trafficked solutions. To Colombians, he was a buyer. To the Chinese, a seller of fentanyl precursors. To Mexican growers, a patron. To corrupt officials, a checkbook. And to desperate communities drowning in cartel warfare, he was a paradox, violent yet dependable. But the power came with blood. The 2000s marked an era of narco violence in Mexico. As El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel clashed with the Zetas, the Tijuana cartel, and the Beltran-Leyva organization, cities like Ciudad Juarez became war zones. Bodies hung from bridges. Entire police departments resigned. Journalists were murdered in daylight. The lines between cartel and state blurred. And in the middle of it all, El Chapo thrived. His strategy was brutal and effective. Target the leadership of rival cartels. Remove the head, let the body rot. Bribe the local police to turn a blind eye. Fund community projects to secure popular support. Use high-tech encrypted phones to communicate. When one was compromised, discard it and replace the network. Nothing lasted longer than it needed to, except his rule. He also implemented a policy of redundancy. If a tunnel was discovered, 5 more were ready. If a route was blocked, another would open. If a lieutenant was killed, another had already been trained. The cartel was not a business. It was an organism, self-healing, constantly mutating. Internationally, El Chapo's influence began to infect even the global economy. The cash flow from his trafficking empire fueled illegal banking networks, offshore shell companies, and real estate empires. Dirty money was cleaned through casinos, racetracks, and front businesses. Entire ports were compromised. Customs agents were paid more to look the other way than to enforce the law. And all the while his legend grew. People told stories of how he'd personally attend cartel weddings disguised as a waiter, of how he'd slip through government raids by hiding under bathtubs or behind rotating walls, of how once he gave a waitress a $50,000 tip for recognizing him but saying nothing. Whether true or not, these stories kept him untouchable. But in the shadows of this empire, cracks began to form. Younger cartel members grew restless. Some wanted more, others less. Rumors swirled about betrayal, about family members being used as leverage, about informants hiding among the trusted. And across the border, the Drug Enforcement Administration had begun to evolve. They weren't just chasing shipments anymore, they were following the money. Tapping phones, turning lieutenants, watching, waiting. But Guzman didn't panic. He adapted. He focused on his family, grooming his sons, known as Los Chapitos, to carry the torch. He expanded into Europe. He studied law enforcement patterns. He changed safe houses weekly. And he clung to his greatest advantage, unpredictability. But even phantoms can cast shadows long enough to be followed. As the body count rose and political pressure mounted, an international coalition began to form. A decision was made. El Chapo was no longer just a Mexican problem. He was a threat to hemispheric stability, and someone somewhere was going to catch him. They just had to wait for him to come up for air. Tunnels and traps. The desert between Mexico and the United States stretches wide and hostile sand heat and surveillance towers. To most, it is a barrier. To El Chapo, it was just another problem to be solved. And he didn't solve problems with guns alone. He solved them with blueprints. In the early 2000s, when border enforcement tightened and the U.S. government escalated efforts to curb trafficking, Guzman turned inward underground, to be exact. He assembled a team of engineers, architects, and former miners. Their task built tunnels that defied imagination. The first was crude, no more than a narrow crawl space linking a warehouse in Tijuana to a storage unit in San Diego. But even that primitive design proved revolutionary. Within days, hundreds of pounds of marijuana had moved without detection. Encouraged by success, Guzman doubled down. Over time, his tunnels evolved into marvels of criminal engineering. Some extended over half a mile long. They included reinforced walls, lighting systems, oxygen ventilation, and even rail tracks. The DEA would later call them the gold standard of smuggling. These tunnels were not just tools, they were symbols. Symbols that El Chapo was always 10 steps ahead. As U.S. agents patted down trucks and deployed drug-sniffing dogs, tons of cocaine quietly slipped beneath their feet, gliding through darkness toward the American market. The trap was elegant in its simplicity: fight the war above ground, win it underground. But the tunnels weren't just for drugs. They became lifelines for Guzman himself, escape routes, meeting corridors, transportation lines for weapons cache, even people. In Culiacan, Sinaloa's capital, and the cartel's nerve center homes were retrofitted with hidden trapdoors leading to entire networks of subterranean passages. From above, they looked like modest ranch-style houses. Below, they were escape vaults. When government forces raided a suspected safe house, El Chapo would vanish through the bathroom floor. It wasn't magic. It was infrastructure. One such raid in 2014 would become the stuff of legend, acting on intelligence. Mexican Marines stormed a coastal residence believed to house Guzman. They entered through the front, sweeping room to room. But the kingpin was already on the move. He had slipped into a narrow tunnel hidden beneath a bathtub. That tunnel led to the city's sewer system, and from there to another house. By the time the authorities realized he was gone, what's more disturbing than a ghost with a blueprint? Back in the United States, the DEA grew increasingly frustrated. Despite years of wiretaps, confidential informants, and joint operations, the drugs kept flowing. Every time a tunnel was discovered, another would be uncovered weeks later in a different state, connecting different points. In one case, a 1,500-foot tunnel was found beneath a warehouse in Otay Mesa. The entrance was hidden beneath a hydraulically operated floor covered with crates of jalapeno peppers. And while the tunnels became a media fascination to Guzman, they were simply practical. They didn't need to be beautiful. They just needed to work. Each tunnel was an extension of his philosophy: avoid confrontation, outthink the enemy. It wasn't that he loved violence, he used it when needed. But his favorite victories were silent, clean, untraceable. Still, silence doesn't last forever. In 2014, a multi-agency operation closed in on a safe house in Mazatlan, a coastal city far from the mountains he once called home. Intelligence had traced cell phone signals, narrowed movement patterns, and identified key suppliers. The safe house looked ordinary, painted white, nothing ostentatious. But inside, Guzman was hiding behind reinforced steel doors and accompanied by bodyguards armed with grenade launchers. And yet he surrendered. No firefight, no resistance, no monologue, just silence and handcuffs. The world watched in awe. After 13 years on the run, the most elusive fugitive in the Western Hemisphere had been caught. Cameras flashed, presidents took victory laps. News headlines called it the end of an era. But what most didn't know, couldn't imagine, was that Guzman had already started planning his escape. From within his cell, he studied the prison's layout. He identified weaknesses. Trusted lieutenants bribed contractors. Engineers went to work. Over the course of months, another tunnel was dug, this time not into the United States, but beneath the very prison that claimed to contain him. It began in a construction site over a mile away, and ended directly beneath the shower in his cell, not a foot off. The night of July 11th, 2015, cameras in Guzman's cell showed him pacing. He walked to the shower, always the one spot blind to surveillance, and vanished. The guards were confused. Hours passed before the alert went out. When they finally entered his cell, they found a hole in the floor, a ladder, a tunnel, and empty silence. This was not just another escape. This was a statement. El Chapo had tunneled out of Mexico's most secure prison again. The audacity stunned the world. The U.S. government seethed. The Mexican government was humiliated. Citizens were outraged. Some laughed. Others wept. The myth of El Chapo had grown beyond a man. It had become an idea that no wall was high enough, no cage strong enough, no system incorruptible enough. But even ideas cast shadows, and shadows eventually betray the body that casts them. The ghost who escapes. The morning after his second prison escape, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was already gone somewhere beneath the soil of central Mexico, carried by darkness and loyalty. At Altiplano, the high-security prison hailed as Mexico's most impenetrable fortress, all that remained was a hole, a silence, and a growing sense of humiliation so profound it rippled across continents. It wasn't just a jailbreak, it was a statement of supremacy. The escape tunnel stretched over a mile, complete with lights, oxygen, and a modified motorcycle mounted on rails used to shuttle out dirt, and eventually the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere. The cartel didn't just outsmart the prison, they outbuilt it. They knew where the surveillance blind spots were. They knew where the foundation was weakest. They had blueprints, they had time, and above all, they had inside help. For the Mexican government, it was a catastrophe. For the DEA and U.S. officials, it was a nightmare repeating itself. For Guzman, it was a victory performed in silence, no bullets, no bloodshed, just precision and patience. Once free, he disappeared with the wind. No convoy, no public threats, no appearances. Just absence, his most dangerous quality, a man without location, without calendar, without trace. His enemies called him a ghost. His followers called him a genius. Both were correct. El Chapo's return to freedom wasn't about celebration. It was about consolidation. He returned to a world more fragile than before. The Sinaloa cartel, though powerful, was now fractured by external assaults and internal tensions. The DEA had tightened its grip. U.S. satellites scanned the desert. Rival cartels were circling like vultures. Some within his ranks questioned his leadership. Others whispered of succession. So he moved carefully. He retreated to the mountains of Sinaloa, to his stronghold among the pines and dirt roads where only loyalty lived. His safe houses were remote, layered in lookouts and traps. Drones couldn't see them. Helicopters couldn't land. The terrain favored the hunted, especially when the hunted knew every ridge, every shadow, every echo. But even the best ghosts leave footprints. Guzman, perhaps emboldened by legend, began making mistakes. He communicated more frequently, trusted too easily, took meetings. And then came the one decision that would unravel him, not a shipment, not a betrayal, but a story. In a moment of hubris, or perhaps vanity, El Chapo agreed to a secret interview with American actor Sean Penn and Mexican actress Kate del Castillo. He wanted to tell his side. A movie, a biography, something to immortalize his myth in his own words. The meeting was arranged in the heart of the jungle. Armed men escorted the visitors. They drank, they laughed, they listened. Guzman dressed simply, spoke with pride about his empire, about the families he fed, the children he clothed. He portrayed himself not as a criminal, but a consequence, a product of poverty and opportunity. But what he didn't see was the storm gathering beyond the trees. Unbeknownst to him, Mexican intelligence had been tracking communications related to the meeting. Though the journalists were allowed to leave untouched, their presence ignited alarms in government war rooms. El Chapo had resurfaced, and this time the world was watching. A manhunt began, coordinated, transnational, and relentless. Mexican Marines trained by U.S. forces were deployed with drones, informants, and newly acquired intelligence. The circle began to tighten. And then came Los Mochis, a small city near the Pacific coast, quiet and unassuming, became the focal point of the operation. Authorities received a tip Guzman was hiding in a house shielded by bodyguards but vulnerable. In the early hours of January 8, 2016, an elite Marine unit launched a raid. The firefight was brief but intense. 5 cartel gunmen were killed. 1 Marine was wounded. But El Chapo once again vanished, slipping through a tunnel beneath the bathtub into the city's drainage system. But this time something was different. Authorities had blocked the escape route, and when Guzman emerged from a manhole on a nearby street, soaked and breathless, he found no convoy waiting. He hijacked a car with one of his lieutenants and attempted to flee. He didn't get far. Captured by local police, verified by fingerprint and DNA, Guzman was finally in custody again. This time he wore no grin. There was no press conference, no taunts, only quiet resignation. But the government had learned its lesson. No longer willing to risk another escape, Mexico agreed to extradite him to the United States, a move long resisted, now seen as inevitable. After legal hurdles and months of negotiation, El Chapo was flown in 2017 under tight security to New York, where a windowless cell awaited him in Manhattan's Metropolitan Correctional Center. The ghost was caged, but even behind bars his shadow lingered. The question on everyone's mind was no longer, "Where is he?" but what comes next. The man who once tunneled beneath nations now found himself in a concrete box alone for 23 hours a day. No calls, no visitors, only his thoughts and the distant echoes of an empire unraveling. The price of loyalty. Inside the world of El Chapo, loyalty was the currency that bought survival. But it was also a double-edged sword, revered, enforced, and ultimately betrayed. When Guzman returned to federal custody, a silent tremor spread through the inner ranks of the Sinaloa cartel. His reappearance on U.S. soil meant that secrets long buried might finally be unearthed, and secrets were a liability no one wanted exposed. For years, loyalty had been the scaffolding of Guzman's empire. He had rewarded his inner circle with power, wealth, and protection. Families of fallen soldiers were compensated. Betrayers were eliminated swiftly and without warning. It was a simple, brutal philosophy: be useful, be loyal, and be quiet. But as the net tightened, so did the desperation. The U.S. prosecutors, building their case, knew something critical. Guzman never acted alone. His power was vast, but it was not solitary. Couriers, enforcers, pilots, bankers, chemists, engineers, his network spanned thousands. And within that mass of faces were those who had fallen out of favor. Men and women once loyal, now forgotten, imprisoned or afraid. Those would be the keys to bringing him down. The government reached out, quietly, deliberately. Deals were offered, sentences reduced, families protected. And slowly the fortress of silence around Guzman began to crack. One of the first major cracks came in the form of Vicente Zambada Nibla, son of Ismael El Mayo, Zambada Guzman's longtime partner and co-founder of the Sinaloa Cartel. Vicente, captured in 2009 and extradited to the U.S., agreed to cooperate in exchange for a plea deal. He revealed the inner workings of the cartel's supply routes, its bribery systems, and even meetings he had attended alongside El Chapo. The betrayal struck deep. The Zambadas and Guzmans had once shared power like kings. Now one of their sons was turning state's witness. But it didn't stop there. Damaso Lopez Nunez, a former Mexican prison official who had helped engineer El Chapo's 2001 escape, had since risen to a high-ranking cartel position. After his own arrest, he too flipped. He offered prosecutors rare insight into Guzman's escape from Altiplano, the internal war that followed, and the methods used to corrupt state officials. Lopez's testimony was surgical. He didn't just describe what happened, he named names. Who approved what? When it was done? Who was paid? How much? Every layer peeled back revealed another face, another deal, another brick in the empire's foundation. And then came the betrayals from within Guzman's bloodline. El Chapo's own cousin and former cartel operative Jesus El Rey Zambada took the stand during the trial. He described bribes paid to Mexico's top law enforcement officials, how shipments were labeled, how warehouses were stocked, how planes flew in at night with cargo. With every word, the courtroom grew colder. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of these testimonies wasn't the information, it was the psychology behind them. Each man who took the stand had once sworn fealty to El Chapo. They had killed for him, lied for him, risked everything to carry out his orders. Yet when the walls closed and survival overtook loyalty, and in many cases it wasn't fear of death that prompted them, it was fear for their families. Because Guzman's empire had become toxic. As he rose, he centralized power around himself and his sons, Los Chapitos. Old allies were sidelined. Some disappeared, others were hunted. Those who once called him brother began to see him as threat. And with Guzman in U.S. custody, his power was no longer absolute. The man who once controlled ports and provinces now spoke through a plexiglass window. His voice, once an echo across hemispheres, was now contained inside an 8-by-10 cell. The courtroom became a crucible of vengeance and confession. Prosecutors laid out a mosaic of witnesses. Former cartel accountants, assassins, pilots, lovers. Each brought a puzzle piece. Together, they formed a portrait not just of one man, but of a system built on fear. And fear has a short shelf life when no one's watching your back. There were no grand gestures in these betrayals, no dramatic monologues, just testimony, cold, steady damning. One witness recounted how Guzman personally ordered a man to be buried alive after a minor theft. Another described a torture room with a drain in the center for blood. Others spoke of suitcases full of cash delivered to generals. Phones wiped, children used as bargaining chips, bodies dissolved in acid. Every story added weight to the chains being built, and yet, even amid this collapse of trust, Guzman never broke. He sat quietly, his face calm, his posture rigid. He denied nothing, admitted nothing, reacted to nothing. If he felt rage, it was hidden. If he felt fear, it never surfaced. It was as if the man himself had turned to stone. But outside the courtroom, the ripple effects were seismic. With so many high-level operatives flipping, the cartel's leadership fractured. A power struggle emerged between Los Chapitos and other factions loyal to El Mayo. Blood spilled in Culiacan. Messages were scrawled on bridges. Bodies dumped with notes. Trust evaporated. And the question remained, without El Chapo at the helm, would the empire collapse or evolve? That question lingered over every testimony, every sealed plea deal, every bulletproof witness transport. Loyalty had once made the Sinaloa cartel the most formidable force in the Western Hemisphere. But now that same loyalty tested, frayed, bought, and sold was the lever breaking it apart. Manhunt across continents. El Chapo was behind bars. But the manhunt had begun long before his capture, and it had reshaped how law enforcement pursued transnational criminals forever. For years, Joaquin Guzman had been not just Mexico's most elusive fugitive, but a thorn in the side of international law enforcement. The DEA, U.S. Marshals, FBI, and Homeland Security all wanted him caged, but each attempt had failed not because of incompetence, but because of design. Guzman had crafted his life like a labyrinth, with every exit calculated, every betrayal anticipated. After his 2001 escape from Puente Grande, the U.S. government intensified pressure on Mexico. Joint operations were organized, intelligence, shared satellite surveillance increased. But El Chapo didn't just disappear, he adapted. His safe houses were temporary, wired with tunnels and escape routes. His communications shifted to encrypted systems. He moved through mountain ranges guarded not by soldiers but by entire villages loyal to his presence. To catch him, the U.S. and Mexico had to change tactics. They began by attacking the infrastructure, capturing chemists, warehouse managers, accountants, and most importantly, the logistics team. These weren't the flashy cartel bosses. They were the back end, the ones who knew where the shipments landed, when the trucks moved, where the planes refueled. One such breakthrough came in 2011, when intelligence linked a specific jet flying from Venezuela to Honduras, with cocaine tied to the Sinaloa cartel. The tail number led to a shell company. That company led to a financial trail. And that trail eventually pointed to Guzman's inner circle. But capturing him wasn't just about surveillance, it was about patience. The DEA stationed agents across Mexico, Guatemala, and Colombia. They didn't flash badges or make arrests. They listened. They waited. They followed wives, cousins, nephews, even doctors. They traced burner phones, watched ATM withdrawals, mapped out ghost properties. They learned El Chapo's rhythm. The key they discovered wasn't finding him. It was narrowing the moments when he let his guard down. Those moments were few, but they existed. When he visited his twin daughters, when he met with one of his many mistresses, when he held secret summits with Los Chapitos or key allies from South America. The pressure on Mexico intensified. Billions in U.S. funding flowed into the Merida Initiative meant to combat organized crime. But with every dollar came expectation, and with every expectation came risk. Mexican Marines were retrained often in the U.S. They were given helicopters, armored vehicles, and intelligence support. These were not beat cops, they were elite forces. And they were given one name, El Chapo. In 2012 and 2013, a series of raids came close, painfully close. In Culiacan, Marines surrounded a neighborhood believed to house Guzman. But by the time they breached the gates, he had vanished down a trap door. The house connected to the sewer system. From there, he moved from one location to another, each one previously mapped and reinforced. It was like chasing vapor. But each near miss gave investigators something new intel on his habits. Confirmation of his tunnel system's hints of dissent within the cartel. Slowly they closed the circle. The most decisive shift came not from boots on the ground, but from a whisper in the dark. An informant never publicly named revealed a pattern. El Chapo had grown less cautious. His obsession with making a film about his life had led to increased communication with outsiders. A certain actress, a foreign journalist. Arrangements were being made, phones were being used, schedules were emerging. It was a rare lapse in judgment, perhaps driven by ego or loneliness, but it was enough. The DEA and Mexican intelligence worked together, triangulating locations based on satellite data, cell tower pings, and intercepted messages. They identified a compound in the mountains outside Tamazula, near the border of Sinaloa and Durango. The area was remote, protected by forests and sheer cliffs. But the Marines went in anyway. The operation executed in October 2015 was brutal. Gunfire echoed across the ridges, bodies dropped. But again, no El Chapo. He had fled hours earlier, tipped off by a last-minute alert, but he was bleeding, and he was scared. The net had torn, but it was tightening. Authorities began monitoring hospitals, clinics, and pharmacies. They tracked narcotics orders, intercepted medical shipments, and watched roads rarely patrolled. It paid off. In January 2016, a call intercepted between two cartel operatives discussed a package arriving in Los Mochis, a sleepy coastal city known more for shrimping than crime. Intelligence teams suspected it was Guzman, injured and in need of medical attention. The raid was fast and surgical. At 4:30 a.m., Marines breached the safe house. The gunfight lasted minutes. 5 of Guzman's men were killed. 1 Marine was wounded. But once again, the kingpin had disappeared into the tunnels beneath the house. Only this time, the authorities had anticipated the move. They had mapped the drainage lines, blocked exits, deployed street patrols. As Guzman surfaced from a manhole miles away, soaked and disoriented, he and his bodyguard hijacked a passing car. But the escape was clumsy. Local police spotted the vehicle, initiated a stop, and made the arrest. No gunfire, no resistance. After nearly 13 years of pursuit across mountains, borders, and oceans, El Chapo was in custody. Again. But this time, he wouldn't be allowed the privilege of tunnels or complicit guards. This time, the extradition papers were already in motion. The kingpin who once commanded nations had run out of moves. The manhunt had ended not with a bullet, but with a whisper, and the long, methodical echo of justice catching up to the ghost who once ruled from the shadows. Trial of the century. The cold corridors of the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan felt more like a tomb than a jail. It was here, beneath layers of concrete and surveillance, that Joaquin El Chapo Guzman awaited the trial that would determine not just his fate, but the fate of a myth. He spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. No television, no phone, no contact with his wife or children. The lights were always on, the air stale. A man who once traversed jungles and mountaintops, whose orders crossed borders faster than legislation, now lived in a box. And then came the trial. On November 5, 2018, in the Eastern District of New York, United States versus Joaquin Guzman Loera began. It would last nearly 3 months. 12 jurors, 36 witnesses, 14 of them former cartel members. Countless exhibits, videos, photos, voice recordings, ledgers, satellite images, and secret messages, all painting a picture that stretched beyond criminality. This was not just about drugs. It was about the architecture of a criminal empire that had reshaped entire nations. Security was unprecedented. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Jurors were anonymous and escorted daily. The courtroom was sterilized, fortified, and turned into a battlefield of information. The government called it a look into the soul of the Sinaloa cartel. But it was more than that. It was the public unraveling of a myth. The prosecutors began with logistics. Cold, hard facts. Cocaine shipments hidden in jalapeno cans. Submarines disguised as fishing vessels. Private planes with false tail numbers. Cocaine bricks stamped with smiley faces or the initials JGL. Then came the cash millions stuffed in ceiling tiles inside car panels, buried beneath ranches. One witness testified about moving $10 million across the border in 5-gallon paint buckets. Bribes to Mexican generals. Police paid to reroute patrols. Customs officers bought with stacks of $100 bills. And then the violence. Witnesses detailed torture houses, acid baths, enemies buried alive, bodies dissolved, others dismembered. One man described Guzman personally beating a rival with a tree branch before ordering his execution. Another spoke of a man being shot and burned in front of his own children. But perhaps the most devastating testimonies came from those who had once called El Chapo boss. Jesus Zambada, Damaso Lopez, Vicente Zambada Nebla. Each walked to the stand eyes down, surrounded by federal agents. Some wore bulletproof vests under their clothes. They were traitors to the cartel, to the oath of silence, but to the court they were keyholes into darkness. One by one, they painted a portrait not of chaos, but of orchestration. Every act of brutality had a purpose. Every shipment a route, every bribe a price. El Chapo didn't rule with impulse. He ruled with design. The defense, led by Jeffrey Lichtman, tried to redirect the spotlight. They argued Guzman was merely a scapegoat, a puppet, while the real kingpin, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, remained free. They pointed to corruption within Mexican government, to contradictions in witness testimony, to the deals made in exchange for leniency. But the weight of the evidence was tectonic. Audio recordings of Guzman discussing drug prices, text messages between him and his mistress discussing shipments and betrayals, surveillance videos of cartel warehouses, GPS data tracking airdrops. It wasn't one nail in the coffin, it was thousands. Even so, Guzman remained composed. He arrived each day in a suit, smiling faintly, watching carefully. His wife, Emma Coronel, sat behind him, stoic, loyal, unreadable. They exchanged glances, but never words. And then came the moment that fractured the air in the courtroom. The government introduced a witness who had worked as an IT engineer for Guzman. He had helped design the encrypted communication network the cartel used. What Guzman didn't know was that the engineer had secretly cloned the system and given the DEA access. Agents had been listening the entire time. Recordings played for the court, Guzman talking casually about shipments, giving orders, laughing. It was the moment the myth met its own voice and the courtroom turned to ice. On February 12, 2019, the jury returned with its verdict. Guilty on all 10 counts. Operating a criminal enterprise. Drug trafficking, money laundering, use of firearms, conspiracy to commit murder. Each charge was damning. Together, they were a life sentence. The courtroom did not erupt. There were no gasps, just silence. El Chapo sat still. No reaction, no visible change in expression. As if the weight of the moment was irrelevant to a man who had lived outside law for most of his life. But the myth cracked. This was the end. Not a shootout, not a tunnel. Just steel bracelets and the verdict of a nation. On July 17, 2019, Joaquin Guzman was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. He was ordered to forfeit $12.6 billion, an estimate of the money his cartel had generated. And then he was transferred to ADX Florence, the most secure prison in the United States. It would be his final home, a small cell. No windows, no visits. A concrete bed, a steel toilet, 23 hours of isolation a day. No tunnels, no calls, no orders. The courtroom had become the grave of the legend. And outside, a world once shaped by his influence began to shift, trying to determine whether it had truly severed the head or merely cut one of many. Locked away forever, the doors at ADX Florence closed like the final pages of a book, heavy, slow, and irreversible. Dubbed the Alcatraz of the Rockies, the facility is carved into the isolation of Colorado's high desert. Its halls echo with silence, and its cells are made not for reform, but containment. This is where the United States sends the men it never wants to see again. On July 19, 2019, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman arrived there, prisoner 89914-053. He entered without the sound of a camera flash or the whisper of a journalist. There were no more tunnels, no more bribes, no more loyal guards. Just reinforced steel motion detectors, remote-operated doors, and unbreakable routines. His cell measured 7 feet by 12. Concrete walls, a solid steel bed, a bolted desk, a toilet sink unit, a slit for light, a slot for food. His windows, narrow-angled upward, show nothing but sky. Even the air seems to move with caution. This was not a prison, it was a vacuum. ADX Florence had held terrorists, spies, traitors, and killers, but none carried the mythos of Guzman. None had once been described as a man more powerful than heads of state. None had built underground empires beneath sovereign borders. But here he was, just a man, alone, measured, reduced. Prison officials immediately placed him under Special Administrative Measures, SAMs, a strict protocol designed for inmates deemed an ongoing threat. The purpose: silence. He was forbidden from speaking to the press. No unmonitored communication, no touching his lawyers, no conversations with other inmates. Even his letters were screened, censored, or blocked. For a man who once ran an empire with a whisper, silence was the sharpest punishment. Time moved differently inside those walls. Meals arrived through slots. Exercise was allowed for 1 hour a day, alone in a cage the size of a dog kennel. Books were allowed, but only in limited quantity. There were no televisions, no visits from his wife, no conversations with his children, just routines, just concrete. Inmates at ADX often report hallucinations, paranoia, anxiety. Some bang their heads against the wall. Others stop speaking. The silence does not comfort, it erodes. But El Chapo remained composed, at least in the reports. No outbursts, no hunger strikes, no escape attempts. Perhaps he understood that here no guards could be bribed, no blueprints smuggled, no tunnels dug through the bedrock. Here he was no longer a ghost. He was a prisoner of time, of silence, of memory. Outside, the world he once ruled had begun to fragment. The Sinaloa cartel did not die with his sentencing, it evolved. His sons, Los Chapitos, fought to consolidate power. Their methods, however, lacked the surgical discipline of their father. They leaned toward chaos, public executions, kidnappings, high-speed shootouts in broad daylight. Culiacan erupted in violence during one infamous episode in 2019 when Mexican forces captured one of Guzman's sons, Ovidio. Within hours, the city was under siege. Cartel gunmen outnumbered and outgunned law enforcement. Tanks rolled through streets. Civilians were caught in crossfire. To prevent bloodshed, the government released Ovidio. It was a haunting reminder that even caged El Chapo's name still opened doors and closed them. But inside ADX, he would never witness it firsthand. He would never hear the gunfire, never feel the desert air, never issue a command. Occasionally, rumors would surface, a hunger complaint, a letter written in shaky script, a plea for better conditions. His legal team argued that the conditions were torturous, inhumane, that Guzman was suffering physically, deteriorating mentally. They cited sleeplessness, memory loss, depression. But the system held firm. For the United States government, El Chapo's fate was sealed not by revenge, but by finality. He had been judged, sentenced, and buried alive in concrete. And yet, in a way, he lingered. Documentaries were filmed, podcasts produced, songs written. Some hailed him as a hero, others a monster, but all agreed he had reshaped the landscape of modern crime. Few traffickers in history had operated with such scale. Fewer still had eluded capture for so long, and none had walked twice out of maximum security prisons only to be locked away forever in a place no one escapes. Even as new cartels rose and fentanyl claimed lives by the thousands, Guzman remained a cautionary tale. A man who built an empire with vision, discipline, and cruelty only to be crushed by the very silence he had once used as a weapon. No cameras record his days now. No microphone captures his thoughts. He wakes, eats, walks, and sleeps in a place designed to erase him. But legends, as history proves, are hard to silence. His face still appears on T-shirts. His name still echoes in narco corridos. His story still sells. And deep within the concrete walls of a prison that allows no exit, Joaquin Guzman Loera breathes, remembers, and waits for nothing. The lesson he left behind. Power built on fear will always command silence, but never peace. In the wake of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's rise and fall, the world is left with a mosaic of lessons, fragments of an empire that once cast shadows across nations. His story is not one of justice or redemption. It is a cautionary tale stitched with ambition, cruelty, brilliance, and the terrifying efficiency of organized chaos. His name, now locked in a 7 by 12-foot cell, once carried the weight of armies. And yet behind every shipment, every bribe, every tunnel was a boy from Sinaloa who learned early that the world doesn't wait for the poor to catch up, it forces them to leap or be left behind. That boy leapt further than anyone imagined. But what El Chapo left behind is not just blood and legend. It's the anatomy of a system that rewards shadows. A blueprint of how empires rise in the gaps between laws. A sobering truth about demand and denial, because every kilo smuggled began with a request. Every dollar earned in Sinaloa was paid in Chicago, Los Angeles, or New York. For years, the U.S. government chased a man, but they were also chasing their own appetite. The trial may have ended, the cell door may have closed, but the machine he helped build remains. Cartels evolved, routes shifted, names changed. The product, fentanyl, meth, heroin, never stopped moving. And for every Guzman caged, others wait to fill the vacuum. Quicker, younger, just as cruel, perhaps even more so. Because El Chapo didn't destroy the system, he revealed it. He showed the world how bribery seeps into institutions, how impunity rots from the inside, how loyalty becomes a weapon, how myth can shield a man longer than body armor. And perhaps most chilling of all, he showed us how easy it is to disappear in plain sight. But beyond the empire and the bloodshed, what remains? Families broken, lives consumed, neighborhoods in fear, thousands of unnamed victims whose stories never made the news, communities turned into battlegrounds, governments corrupted, trust eroded. And for what? A kingdom that crumbled in silence, a legacy buried beneath concrete. His fall did not restore peace. It reminded us how fragile peace truly is. Yet in the end, there is still choice. For the young boy in La Tuna watching traffickers pass with golden watches and silent eyes, for the factory worker tempted by easy cash, for the lawman deciding whether to look the other way, and for the buyer holding a pill that carries someone else's ruin, there is choice. And it is in these small human decisions, not courtrooms or commandos, where the true war is fought. The story of El Chapo is over. But the question he leaves behind is not how do we dismantle the next cartel king before he's crowned. Because the most dangerous empire is not the one that stands. It's the one we're still building without realizing. Thank you for following this crime-solving journey. If you find it interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the Crime Trail channel so you don't miss out on upcoming exciting stories.